Well, that was quite a reasonably nice sunset. Some dark grey clouds that are gradually building up, which means that the forecasted cloudy conditions and ultimately rain later in the night will likely occur. This is the outside of Lound Wood. There's not a breath of wind. There was a bit of breeze early on today. That's died out now. Hopefully we can get some moth trapping in, maybe just a couple of hours, but it depends how the old generator's feeling. I gave it somewhat of a pick-me-up yesterday, which means it'll probably never work again, but we'll give it a go. Now, first time that I've trapped for a while. It is the 25th of October today, and hopefully there'll still be quite a decent range of moths around. Conditions are really good. I was going to go in the centre or just inside the entrance to Lound Wood, but now that wind's dropped, it means I can trap right at the entrance and hopefully attract any lingering migrant moths that may be still in the area, or indeed have come into the area in the last couple of days, because there's been one or two nice moths turn up, mostly in southern counties and eastern counties, but I just hope for a decent selection. Well, the generator's off and running, sounding a lot better than it did the other night when I came out here. Tried to fire it up and it fired up but barely ran. So we'll see what happens. I'll get set up and we'll see if we can get some moths. It's lit up. That's something. You certainly couldn't get hardly a better evening. It's been a lovely, warm, late October day today. And let's hope there's a decent amount of mid-autumn moth activity. There's plenty of species to go for, potential species, so we'll see what we can catch. Now that appears to be working, it's time for a brew. Well, it seems like a long time since we were trapping. The last session was on Red Hill, which is only a couple of 100 yards away really from where I'm sat now. and that ended suddenly with generator failure. The generator just sort of virtually cut out enough, or slowed down enough to make the light cut off. The trouble is with MVs, once they've gone off, you have to wait a quarter of an hour, half an hour before they'll light again. You have to really let them cool down. So it wasn't worth starting, but almost certainly there'd have been some problems with the generator anyway, because I did look at it yesterday and it was in need of a bit of attention, routine maintenance. So hopefully that's done now. Clean the carburetor out and hopefully we're back to normal service has resumed. But we'll see what moths we get tonight. They may well not be the numbers that I was hoping for, not after this dry summer that we've had, but probably the commonest moth I would imagine would be November moth, or November moth aggregate, as we should all say. But we'll see what comes in. Hopefully there'll be a surprise maybe on the micro front. That would be nice. It would be nice to get something different or unusual. That would be a real highlight. Well, this first hour has been very quiet. It's occasionally slightly too breezy for what I'd like, but then that breeze dies down again and it's very pleasant. But there's not a lot flying in truth, or there doesn't appear to be at the moment. Sometimes I don't think it's worth starting the trap at dusk. Now I know a lot of you will probably shout at me, but sometimes if you leave it a couple of hours and then go out and turn the bright light on, you'll get a lot of moths then. In fact, knocked you in just thinking of coming in now. But what we have had in is 5 November moth, single chestnut, a turnip moth, which is a most uninspiringly marked turnip moth. I'll try and show you in a bit once it's settled down. Carcina quirkana, which is an attractive, almost tortrix-like micro moth, very commonly seen and quite often asked for as an ID request. And then there's just been a sallow that's just turned up. Now something else does come in. I hope to try and catch it. I did tell you that the turnip moth was probably the most uninspiring turnip moth that I've ever seen. Some specimens can be considerably lighter than this, or at least the background colour to the wings can be a lot lighter, sometimes quite grey, but then beautifully marked. Others can be almost black. There's very little in the way of defining markings. This one is not quite so black, and it is a very dull moth indeed. But turnip moth quite often can be misidentified. Sometimes can be misidentified as dark swordgrass or pearly underwing. I mean, pearly underwing is a moth. It's one of those moths that once you see it, you instantly recognise it. But turnip moth is well worth learning. It can turn up pretty much any time of the year, but especially more so in autumn, and in its various guises is one to learn. You can avoid one of the easiest pitfalls in moth identification by learning the different varieties and different markings and shades of ground colour that are found within turnip moth. So let's hope for something a bit more colourful. And this is Carcina quirkana, which catches many people out on the basis of it being extremely tortrix-like in shape. Now this shot doesn't show exactly what a beautiful moth this can be, so I will put in a photo somewhere while I waffle on. One of the characteristic features that enable you to identify this moth is the length of the antenna. Those antennae reach as far back as the end of the wings. They're really long in proportion to the size of the moth. So that's one of the key aspects to look out for when trying to identify this species. It's very common, especially in woodlands, but it will turn up occasionally in gardens, although it's a species I've not had that much at home. In general, it's a lovely colour. This one's not the best. It's almost like a reddish brown, sometimes with hints of pink. The wings, the rear of the wings, as you look at it, are slightly edged in a darker reddish colour, but then there's that sort of thin yellow border. And on the edges, the four edges of the wings, there's two sort of yellow marks. It's almost like a rhubarb and custard coloured sort of species. But I love Cartina quercon. It has fond memories for me because it was the first scientific name that Dilys learned, if I remember right, or one of the first. That and Emelina monodactyla. Anyway, there's a couple more moths starting to turn up. There's another turnip moth that's landed, and what looks like a dark chestnut. I'll probably drop photos of these in because a lot of the moths aren't settling down, but at least we've got a few more starting to come in now. Now I'm trying to light this without using the light on the camera because I'm not sure how well the coloration of this moth will show, but this is a red-green carpet. It might not look it under this artificial light, but it really is an attractive moth, but it's a very variable moth. It's very appropriately named as well, because it's almost as if it can't decide whether it wants to be red or green. But I'll drop a photo of a decent specimen with a photo taken in daylight, and you'll see just how attractive red-green carpet can be. But it's a moth that seems to have done really well in the last 10-20 years or so that I've been recording moths. It was regarded as quite a prize, really, all those years ago, but now you would expect most garden traps to take this species during the autumn months. But it's a lovely thing, it's a lovely moth, and one that most people will certainly encounter as long as they continue to trap well into the autumn, which you should do. Autumn can be a really good time, and it can produce low numbers of moths, and often will do, and especially in gardens it will do. But it's well worth it for the moths that could potentially always turn up in autumn. So anyway, that's red-green carpet. It's an attractive little thing, isn't it? Now I know I'll get a reputation for showing you dull brown and rather drab and uninteresting moths, but I can assure you this is purely because this is the brown form, or the dull brown and uninteresting form of green brindled crescent. Should one of the other forms come in, then you would be saying what a wonderful moth, and in order for you to say what a wonderful moth, I'll drop a photo in, hopefully, of both forms, the brown form and the other more beautiful form with the green coloration on. It almost looks like two very different species. Regularly encountered, especially if you trap anywhere rurally and in woodland. This is a moth that will invariably turn up, sometimes in quite good numbers. Well, it's just a few minutes after 8 o'clock, I believe, at the moment. There's a steady trickle of moths coming in, mostly November moths that are flicking in from alongside Lound wood here. It's surprising though, sometimes they do drop down from sort of treetop height. Otherwise it's relatively quiet. There's something there just thinking of coming in. Very few micros though. I've had 2 or 3 sort of micros. I was hoping maybe we might get one of the rarer Eclairis, but so far we haven't done. The sky is now largely clear, but the cloud is quite high, so there's no threat of rain. Rain is forecasted for the early hours of tomorrow morning. So I think a cup of tea's in order. We'll see what else starts to come in. Now here's a regular visitor to many people's moth trap. Obviously an autumn flying species, and this is a moth which is simply called the brick. It is quite intricately marked when you look at a fresh specimen. This one isn't particularly fresh, but you do get the idea of how well marked this species is. It's similar, or can be, to a number of other moths in the autumn, but this one will turn up fairly regularly. I seem to remember that I have taken this at home, but the majority of mine and Dillis's records have always been in the Eakring area and Sherwood Forest as well. But it's a species I've not seen for a year or two from what I can remember. So that's the brick. Now here's a moth that recorded a couple of times before here at Lound. It's quite regularly seen, or it can be, flying low to the ground in the daytime in the Sherwood Forest area, especially Budby South Forest. This is Diurnia lipsiella. Now in spring we get the more familiar Diurnia fagella, which is a really common moth, and looking at this one, although this one is slightly damaged, Diurnia fagella is probably just slightly larger than this less common species. But say, it can be found quite often just fluttering low to the ground, usually about a foot off the ground under oaks. That's the sort of habitat that we've always recorded it. But it's a nice moth. I'm quite surprised. It's a species I'd forgotten about actually. But this is Diurnia lipsiella, and it's a really recorded species in Nottinghamshire. This is one species where you won't catch it in your garden. Well, there's the general vista of the situation. I quite like trapping late in the year, and indeed even through the winter months. Very few people trap during winter. You certainly never hear of people going out on a December evening or in January and February if conditions are mild enough to trap moths. Yes, people will run the trap from home, but once you get to October, trapping from home becomes a rather laborious process, and there's a tendency not to bother doing it. I don't trap that much from home from sort of the end of September, mid-October. Depends on the conditions, because living within any sort of urban conurbation isn't conducive to attracting large numbers of moths, and especially during the winter months you're lucky to get Emelina monodactyla turn up at the light. It's rarely worth bothering trapping from home if you live in a city area or an urban environment. If you want to trap moths this time of year, this being the 25th of October tonight, but from this time onward you really need to head out into woodland in order to attract a decent number of moths and a decent number of species. But you have to bear in mind that you're never going to attract lots of moths this time of year. But what you will get quite often are moths that are rarely recorded. They may well be common, but not all of them. There's quite a few sort of late season and early season specialists that remain frustratingly absent from the lists, the personal lists of many moth trappers. There's a couple of species that I can think of now, just that I can't think of the scientific name to tell you. But it is worth trapping, making the effort. I know it's not as easy to find the enthusiasm to go out on a night when the temperature is struggling to get above 10 centigrade, and certainly if it's below 8, don't bother. It's not worth it at all. But if the temperature is a decent temperature, you can have some good nights. it's one of the joys of moth trapping. You can potentially trap a moth 365 days of the year. I remember one year, did this myself, we went out, it was January the 2nd. We went out and we went up into Sherwood Forest and we trapped a chestnut that came in quite quickly, and then 2 hours later we hadn't had another moth and the temperature dropped, but it was something different to do. Provided a rare winter record. Still always wanted to trap on New Year's Eve. Maybe this will be the year, depending on how mild it is. A while ago I showed you a red-green carpet, and I think I did mention that they can be variable. You can never decide whether they want to be red or green. Well, as you can see, this superb example is very much in the green camp. This is a stunner. I've only ever seen one other red-green carpet as green as this individual. It's a beautiful thing. I'd not seen this one come in, and then during one of my sort of romps around the light, just to see what has sneaked in, spotted this. Hell of a difference from the one that I showed you earlier. Now, I must admit to having showed you some rather dull and uninteresting looking moths, but I think I've excelled myself with this one. But this is typical of the species because this is November moth. Now, this isn't the best marked of November moths, and November moths vary considerably in the intensity of their markings. Some can be as dull as light as you like, such as this one here, but then others can be beautifully marked, all in various shades of grey, with various lines and barring across the wings. It can be very attractive. It's also a moth that varies in size as well. Now, many records, or most records of November moth, will go down as November moth aggregate because there are a number of species that are visually identical. You can't really tell them apart visually. But the vast majority that we get in Nottinghamshire will invariably turn out to be this species, November moth. Well, I'm just deciding whether to carry on and trap for a bit longer or whether to give it another quarter of an hour. In the days when we used to smoke, Dillis and I would say, we'll have another cigarette, then we'll pack up. Which basically translated as meaning we'll give it another 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, see if anything comes in. If it comes in, we carry on. But having packed up cigarettes well over 5 years now, soon be approaching 6, can't have that luxury. So now it's just a case of waiting and seeing and looking. You keep doing it, you keep putting off the packing up process and going home, just in case something comes in, that special moth, that once in a lifetime or new species that you've never seen before drops in. I suppose that's what it's all about. But personally, it's not all about rarities, far from it. It is about knowing and finding out what's where and when. I do like records. I'm a fanatical record keeper. I still am. Just not done so much of it this year, and I've enjoyed not doing so much of it this year, to be honest. And as we've got a noctuid that's just dropped in, I ought to have a look at it, see if it's that special moth, that new species, once in a lifetime migrant. I think it's just a dark chestnut then. Anyway, let's go and have a look. Now, before I do start to pack up, I just wanted to show you this, and this is the opposite extreme to how November moths can be. Remember the one that I showed you? It was just drab, and it was generally featureless. This one isn't, and this is a nice example of November moths and how well marked they can be. Pretty much it's a lighter grey in background coloration, and those three sort of distinct bands, those bands being sort of scalloped along the edges, quite beautifully marked when you look at it. And this is probably one of the better marks of November moths. They're not all sort of colourless and featureless moths. They can be quite nice like this. I don't like to label any moth as being featureless and dull and boring, because quite often when such moths arrive at the trap, they've probably had something of a life, shall we say. This one is fairly fresh and better marked than the one I showed you earlier. All moths are beautiful in their own way. I've got a potentially interesting little micro in here. At first glance, it looks like a small and late Blastobasis hadostella. We shall see what it turns out to be in the morning. But it's just gone 2100 hours now, so I've had 2.5 hours, and the most pleasing thing is the old noisy generator is still gleefully going. I'm quite pleased about that. But a decent number of moths in the end, nothing exciting, no real rarities, nothing extraordinarily interesting to look at. But this nagging breeze has probably put pain to a lot of the moths that would have graced the sheet if it had remained absent. So it's time to pack up and head home. So that's it for another night. Till the next time.